Welcome, everyone. I'm Josh Parker. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy at the Policing Project at NYU School of Law. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of us already, but if you haven't, we're a national policing reform organization dedicated to transparent, equitable, and democratic policing. Our legislative team works with policymakers across the country on a variety of policing issues, including data collection, pretextual traffic stops, law enforcement use of AI, and other policing technologies, and as we're going to discuss today, vehicle pursuits, also known as chases. We know, in part as a result of some of the stellar reporting and research conducted by our panelists today, that pursuits far too often result in serious injuries and fatalities of drivers, passengers, bystanders, and police officers. Our model statute, which we'll touch on later, and our conversation today focuses on both what the data shows about vehicle pursuits and their danger, and how to smartly reform law enforcement agency policies, municipal ordinances, and state laws to restrict and regulate such pursuits. As we'll also discuss later, this past year, we worked closely with community groups and legislators in Hawaii to enact comprehensive vehicle pursuit legislation inspired by our model statute, joining New Jersey and Washington, D.C. as two jurisdictions with state or jurisdiction-wide vehicle pursuit laws or regulations. Before introducing our panelists, let me assure everyone that audience members who wish can get New York CLE credit for attending this webinar. Please listen for the CLE code later in the hour that you'll need to put in the CLE attendance form that will circulate. Also, we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. At any time in the webinar, feel free to submit any questions you have by clicking the Q&A icon on the bottom bar of the Zoom screen, and we'll answer what we can when it comes to be Q&A time. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Starting with Geoffrey Alpert. Geoffrey Alpert is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of South Carolina and an expert on police vehicle pursuits, having written 4 books and more than 50 peer-reviewed articles on pursuits, and having chaired the working group that published the Police Executive Research Forum's Pursuit Guide that's included in the readings. Rodney Bryant is the former chief of the Atlanta Police Department, where he adopted a restrictive pursuit policy. Chief Bryant has served in law enforcement for over 34 years and recently served as national president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Jennifer Gollan, last but not least, is an Emmy-Award-winning investigative reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who recently co-authored a series of articles on the deadly impact of pursuits nationwide. She and her co-reporter were recognized as Pulitzer Prize finalists for that reporting. Okay, let's dive in. Before asking the panelists questions, Jennifer is going to get us started with a short presentation on what she and her co-author, Susie Nielsen, found in their investigation on vehicle pursuits.
Thank you very much, Josh. And I'm so privileged to be here today. I would love to talk about this investigation that we did. It was published in 2024 in the San Francisco Chronicle, and the series title was Fast and Fatal. The stories exposed and examined the soaring death toll tied to police pursuits in the US, mostly over low-level offenses, and the near total immunity that shields officers when they initiate deadly chases that flout the law or kill bystanders. My reporting partner, Susie Nielsen, and I worked for more than a year on this project. We built 5 databases, interviewed 150 grief-stricken families, crash survivors and law enforcement officials, and others. And we also reviewed 112 body and dash camera videos, as well as thousands of pages of police and court records. Our investigation started with a simple question. We wanted to know, how often do people actually die in police pursuits? But when we started asking around, no one knew, even as cities were debating how to regulate these chases. So we set to work. We had learned about this one case about that involved a police pursuit in Louisiana in which two teenage bystanders died. A man had tried to steal a family member's car. We amassed data and public records to track what the government doesn't. Every person who was killed in a police pursuit and the circumstances surrounding their deaths. We found that more than 3,300 people had died in these police chases from 2017 through 2022. The vast majority of these chases began over minor infractions or no crime at all. To build this database of pursuit fatalities, we relied on a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods, including descriptive statistics, comparative analysis, and our own reporting using media reports, police records, and litigation. We merged partial data sets from disparate sources, including NHTSA's forest system, and research organizations such as Mapping Police Violence, Fatal Encounters, and Incarceration.com. We combed through thousands of records of news reports on LexisNexis and Google, as well as lawsuits, medical examiners' reports, and police records. We found that deaths had occurred in every state. Most of these victims were bystanders and passengers. 15 officers had been killed, accounting for just 1%. And we discovered at least 662 hidden fatalities that the federal government had not counted. More than 52,000 people were injured over a 5-year period ending in 2021. And that we also found that deadly pursuits have soared. In 2022, during our reporting, that was the deadliest year on record with 587 fatalities. In 2023, we discovered that there were 539. So since we published our stories, the death toll has continued to be high. We also looked at some of the driving forces behind this death toll. We found that there are no binding national standards that govern when and how police should chase suspects. So officers often operate under permissive rules that enable them to justify chasing just about anyone. Our review of more than 100 departmental policies showed the adoption of stricter policies remains haphazard at best. On the accountability end, we scoured records and we identified 140 officers who appeared to have broken the law or were accused of violating agency policies in a fatal chase. Just 6 of them were criminally charged for their role in these pursuits. Many departments inadequately disciplined officers for violating pursuit policies or the law. One of the cases we focused on involved Janae Carter. She was on her way to buy baby wipes when a driver fleeing police over a license plate violation smashed into her car at 74 miles an hour and killed her boyfriend and 2 children. In Janae's case, prosecutors never charged the fleeing driver with a crime related to having a license plate that belonged to another vehicle. We also found widespread racial disparities. More than a third of those who died in pursuits were Black, even though Black people make up just 1/8 of the US population. Fatal crashes disproportionately occurred in majority Black neighborhoods. And pursuits killed at least 551 bystanders since 2017, and the victims were disproportionately Black. To do this analysis, we conducted a geospatial analysis to match locations of fatal crashes with neighborhood demographics, finding that the deaths, again, were more likely to occur in majority Black neighborhoods. We also looked at the cost to taxpayers. We found that cities and localities had paid $82 million in settlements and judgments involving police pursuits. And this was definitely an undercount because not every locality wanted to give us their records. Police officers rarely contribute to these lawsuit payouts, even when they're accused of violating their agency's pursuit policies or they're fired for allegedly lying to a superior or charged with a felony. So the results of our investigation prompted members of Congress to call on regulators to accurately count how many people die in pursuits nationwide. One member of Congress sent a letter to the Attorney General, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and NHTSA calling for better data. At the state level, the series helped prompt state lawmakers in Hawaii to enact a bill that would establish a policy for all law enforcement agencies across the state to limit chases to certain circumstances. Washington state lawmakers cited the reporting at a House and Senate hearing on the state's pursuit laws. And newsrooms and academics from California to New York drew on our data. NYU's School of Global Public Health relied on our data and analysis for an article that appeared in the medical journal JAMA. I would love it if you had story ideas. I'd love to talk about different projects, and here's my contact information. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing the summaries from your reporting. Very, very helpful context as we go into this conversation. So we're going to start by talking about both the lay of the land at the law enforcement agency level when it comes to pursuit policies and pursuit reform. And we're going to be talking a bit with Chief Bryant about his experience with implementing a restrictive pursuit policy in Atlanta. So let me start with Jeff. How would you describe the lay of the land when it comes to law enforcement agencies? Can you say what proportion of the approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country have restrictive pursuit policies?
Well, to answer your question, Josh, we have to define what you mean by restrictive. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics put out a report. It's the most recent, and I think it was published in, gosh, I think the data was from 2017 or something like that. And it was the first time I had seen any report that showed that there were more restrictive policies than there were judgmental policies. But the point is, what do you mean restrictive? It could be the number of vehicles in a pursuit. It could be speeds. It could be anything. But in terms of restricting pursuits for the type of offense that the officers have seen, no. We really don't know. We know larger cities. We know a few years ago anyway, major city chiefs and major county sheriffs probably had more restrictive policies than smaller towns and sheriff's departments, but we don't even know that for sure. It's a dismal situation we're in terms of data. We're way behind. I mean, thank goodness for the media. Jennifer's report is really important, and the data are better than the government data. So to answer your question, dismal.
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, that's based on our review of kind of of local standards. That's consistent with what we found, which is, there is a number of agencies that make public their pursuit policies, a number of agencies that don't or redact major portions of their policies. But when we look at big cities, there are a pretty high number that do have restrictive pursuit policies in terms of either having an offense list or seriously curbing the ability, the circumstances under which police can engage in pursuits, like NYPD, which recently introduced a restrictive pursuit policy just this past year. Jeff, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add that there's a company out there that sells pursuit policies, and without mentioning any names, the trend has been to use that company because they're very good about writing policies that are they don't leave a lot of restrictions. They don't corner an officer or a department. They're risk averse, and departments like that, and they seem to be buying a lot of those policies, but they're cookie cutter, and I think they're really not helpful. But we're starting to see a majority of departments that I look at have those policies.
Yes, and that kind of gets to why, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, state legislation is quite important because, you know, if you're a small agency, have limited capacity to draft policies, maybe don't have expertise in vehicle pursuits, it's tempting to borrow a policy when, you know, a company that seems quite sophisticated is shopping it to you. But anyway, I want to turn to Chief Bryant, so we can talk about his experience with a restricted pursuit policy in Atlanta, which certainly is a major city. Chief Bryant, first I want to get your reaction to the dangers of pursuits, the data on the dangers of pursuits that Jennifer presented. Was that surprising for you to hear, or in line with what you saw in your long career in law enforcement?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. No, it wasn't surprising at all. With 34 plus years now, I'm closer to 36 now. I've seen a number of car chases, been in a number of car pursuits, and you see the end results in many of them. And then understanding other agencies that are around a metropolitan like the city of Atlanta, you get to hear and see the results of those. So the numbers were not surprising to me at all.
And I imagine that's part of the reason as chief in Atlanta, you adopted a restricted pursuit policy that only allowed chases for particular serious crimes. Could you elaborate on why you decided to adopt a restricted pursuit policy rather than a policy that gives officers more discretion on when to chase?
Yes. So the policy, we previously had a very open-ended policy that allowed police officers to chase. It did have some stipulations where supervisors did have control, but a lot of the responsibilities fell on the officer. And so we had a lot of car chases and bad results in some of those as well. My predecessor, Chief Shields, actually suspended all car chases during that time so that they could be reviewed. And then when I came in, I'm sorry, when I preceded her, when I came in, I had to take a look at it because at the time, this is during 2020, and we were seeing crime throughout the country, and the communities were asking for something. So at the end, we also got the end results from the study that was done, and so I was able to adopt some of the ideas out of that, restricting our chases and our pursuits, and ensuring that officers get to have very little window in doing it, but putting a number of responsibilities on supervisors doing a pursuit.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, one component of the policy is the officers were only permitted to chase if someone in the vehicle was suspected of committing a particular serious crime. Is that correct?
Well, it was even more restrictive than that. They had to know that the individual had committed a crime within a short window. So it couldn't have been the person did something 2 days ago, 3 days ago. We had to know that they did something just previously, and we had to know it was the driver. It wasn't the previous policy said if the car was involved in a carjacking, if the car was involved in a homicide, and that gave us leeway to chase. I changed it that you had to know that the driver, not the car, was involved in that crime.
And I can imagine, but what's the logic behind that?
Because what we were finding is an individual could get a car and then give that car to someone else, and that person may be running for a whole nother reason, or they're thinking that the car is stolen, or their license is suspended, and this isn't the person that we were after at all. And so that is, we thought that it was more important for us to be able to do that. Additionally, what we didn't want to have is an individual that may have been wanted for a crime previously, but we've not confirmed it, or the paperwork was delayed in getting resolved, or whatever the case may be. And now we're in a chase, in a pursuit with an individual who's running for an entirely different reason than why we were after them.
That makes a lot of sense. Chief Bryant, what other means did or could your agency use instead of pursuits to apprehend a suspect?
Yeah, so we looked at technology and continue to take a look at technology. One of them was the uh, vehicle locator, but our bigger we relied heavily on cameras and license plates reader, and those were helpful. It gave when looking at license plate reader, you have to make sure that you're incorporating your investigators to be able to track this vehicle down. Also using our aerial responses just to our helicopters to monitor. So we weren't pursuing a vehicle using our our patrol cars. We would have a helicopter monitor the individual's activity and then just get us to the end location. So those were the things that we were using during that time.
Thanks, Chief Bryant. Jeff, could I get you to weigh in a bit on pursuit alternatives? We'll be talking a bit more about the perf report that you chaired. But is your view that these kind of technologies and modern policing tools can help reduce or eliminate the need for high-speed pursuits?
Well, I think that's the future. Chief mentioned, several alternatives. There's also now the use of drones, where we're seeing in a lot of cities that are using drones to track pursued vehicles. So as the chief said, you don't have to use your patrol car. You don't have to have a risky pursuit. You just see where they go. There are GPS tracking systems. He kind of mentioned those as well. And the cameras, we're seeing more and more cameras out there in the roadways that do capture a lot of information that, if used properly, will help you catch someone afterwards. But the point is to avoid a dangerous chase, particularly in a city like Atlanta or any other city where the streets may be crowded, the streets may be narrow, there are a lot of people around, and that's where these crashes turn deadly. Anything to avoid a chase on a street is going to be helpful. And I think technology is the answer. There are technologies that will shut engines down. Now, using them is a different question. Getting the manufacturers to put those in a vehicle or aftermarket. But the worst thing we can do is simply chase someone, because we know behaviorally people are going to run when they're chased. I mean, you have to admit, or I admit that, yeah, some people will stop, but it isn't very many once they've been running. And as long as they're being chased, it's more likely they're going to keep running. And also, when the police quit chasing, it's more likely that they're going to slow down. And really, that's the goal of public safety, is to get them to slow down. Apprehending them is a different question. When it's a serious offense, I think we all would agree that risking the public is certainly justified to a certain extent when you're dealing with a violent criminal, as opposed to someone, and we saw in Jennifer's data, most of these are traffic offenses. So they're safety violations. Is it really that important to apprehend someone for a safety violation when the risk to the public is going to be much higher?
No, yeah. Thanks, Jeff. That makes a lot of sense. Back to Chief Bryant, how did your officers respond to the policy, to having a restricted pursuit policy? Were they frustrated? Were they open to it? Did it make sense to them?
No, so the initial one, when the policy was suspended and there was no trace policies, yeah, officers were a little taken back by it. They felt that their hands were being tied, but once we gave them a tool to understand that we were going to only utilize a pursuit in the most extreme circumstances, I think that many of them understood why we were going in that direction. We had conversations with them as it relates to the new policy. And so I think that it was well received, having a restrictive policy.
And Josh, let me add,
Jeff.
let me add that the Chief's talking about 2020 or 2021. When I started looking at these pursuits in the 80s, the results of the officers were not that compliant, let's say. You'd hear chicken calls on the radio, you'd hear all sorts of things. It was a whole different world. I think we've come a long way since then, and in some areas we have a long way to go.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think your work with Perf and Jennifer's reporting is helping kind of change the narrative around pursuits and helping officers and law enforcement leaders realize, look, this is dangerous for officers as well. You know, no one is safe when there's a high-speed chase. Chief Bryant, you put your policy into effect. You saw it go into effect for a year or two at least. Did the policy seem to work as intended? How did community members react to it?
Yeah, so initially, I mean, I think the community was a little split on it. We brought some of them in prior to releasing the policy to have some of our stakeholders have some input in what we were about to do and what we thought was best. And so I think that once they had something and they recognized that we weren't just allowing chases to run through the city as previous, that they were okay with it, but in some circumstances, some situations, they were opposed to even that. But I think overall, the community and the police department were very receptive of the restrictive policy.
And Chief Bryant, a criticism we sometimes hear about restrictive pursuit policies is that they encourage drivers to break the law and flee because they know, hey, if you're stopping me for a broken taillight, you're stopping me for playing loud music. There's a policy that says they can't chase me, so I'm just gonna flee. So how do you respond to that criticism that this encourages law breaking?
Yeah, that's a difficult one to measure as it came out in the data, and as Jeff stated earlier, individuals run for unknown reasons. I mean, you can't gauge it. We don't know if once the lights come on, if they were saying they are now deciding, well, because they're not chasing. Well, when we were chasing, they were still running. So that's a difficult thing to measure. There was no evidence. I can't say that we saw significant increases. We saw significant increases when there was a restrictive policy in place or not. It's just very difficult to measure. I can't say that happened.
Yeah, and that's consistent with the study we conducted in 2021 of 2 jurisdictions in Roanoke, Virginia, that had different law enforcement agencies. One introduced a restrictive pursuit policy and one didn't. And there was no increase in crime in the jurisdiction that introduced restrictive pursuit policy. And you could imagine some of that might be due to kind of the technologies and alternatives for apprehending folks that Jeff and Chief Bryant discussed, right? You know, if you're using an automated license plate reader or aerial surveillance or even less technological means like spike strips, there are other means of apprehending folks, even if you're not engaging in a dangerous car chase.
Josh, that's a little bit different question because I think what Chief Bryant was talking about and to question are, and it's a really important question. Unfortunately, we don't know. Now, the state of Washington, with its legislation, the state patrol has kept track of people who flee, and the number is fairly large, but we don't have a baseline. So we don't know if it's the legislation that changed it, if that's the way it's always been. And this is why collecting data that Jennifer was reporting is so important. So we do know the answer to that. We do know if restrictive policies are going to increase people fleeing. And I think that if we do find that out, then I think it's law enforcement. It's like just like anything else. You have to build a smarter mousetrap. You got to figure out, okay, well, what are we going to do? Because chasing is probably the worst thing, but we've got to have an alternative. We got to have a way to apprehend people without putting everyone at risk.
Mm-hmm.
No, thanks so much for that context, Jeff. Jennifer, I want to shift back to you. You know, I gave an example of a study we conducted where an agency adopted a restrictive pursuit policy and crime didn't go up. But I'm curious if you've looked at other agencies that have either loosened their pursuit policy, allowing chases for far more things, or restricted it, saying you can only chase for serious offenses, and what the data shows happens when agencies loosen or restrict their pursuit policies.
Okay, sure. We cited some data and evidence in our reporting. So data from several jurisdictions shows that restricting police pursuits can reduce injuries and fatalities. For example, after Milwaukee adopted one of the nation's stricter pursuit policies in March 2010 by limiting chases to people involved in a violent felony, pursuits declined by nearly 60% the following year. And there's another study that showed that 75% of drivers said they would slow down if they felt safe, for example, free from, any displays of authority. So there is data and evidence out there, and that's sort of some of the data points. Those are some of the data points we came across in our reporting.
Thanks, Jennifer. I know Little Rock is another jurisdiction where when they loosen their pursuit policies, pursuits ballooned. It's a trend across law enforcement agencies. One more question for now for Chief Bryant. When an officer violated the pursuit policy, or if an officer violated the pursuit policy, what happened? What would you do?
Oh, yeah. So we took our pursuit policies very seriously, much like we do our use of force policy. If an officer was in violation, they were disciplined. But we went a step further, that we looked at it to see what the supervisor's responsibilities, and if the supervisors failed to do, oversee or respond accordingly to a pursuit, that individual was disciplined as well.
That makes sense. And that analogy to use of force is something that we've used in our own advocacy, because I think there's a much broader understanding that every agency should have a comprehensive use of force policy. There should be discipline and possibly decertification when officers violate that policy. And there's a growing belief that there should be comprehensive state laws regulating the use of force, given how many fatalities and injuries can result from use of force. And similarly, police pursuits, as Jennifer's presentation showed, unfortunately result in needless fatalities and injuries. And so just like officers, should be held accountable when they violate use of force policies, if they knowingly violate pursuit policies, that's another reason to consider discipline.
Josh, let me interrupt and add something to, again, what Chief was saying about supervisors, because what a critical step that the supervisor is able to control. And if the supervisor either gets involved in the chase or isn't paying attention, or we've seen many cases where cops will shop for the right supervisor at knowing what shift or where which supervisors where. A supervisor is so critical in a pursuit, especially with a vague policy where you're making 34 decisions in a split second, which I think is really unfair to the officer. So at that point, if you're going to have that policy, you really need a well-trained supervisor who's going to step in. And if information isn't provided, ask the right question. And I've seen policies that require them to do that. So we're seeing improvements. But as Chief pointed out, that's such a critical point in a pursuit management plan, to have a supervisor who's willing to take a stand against his or her officers and follow the policy, as opposed to letting them do what maybe they want to do.
Yeah, and you're kind of implying this, but in the heat of the moment, if there's an officer on the street and someone flees from them, you could kind of understand the impulse to chase. Whereas the supervisor, who is not actually in the vehicle, might be able to have a more level-headed kind of decision-making calculus, and that's more likely to adhere with the policy.
Yeah. And hopefully that's why the person got promoted to be a supervisor.
That too. So if you look at our model statute, if you look at Hawaii's law, you look at New Jersey's law, they all, or it's actually a regulation, they all require that all pursuits be supervised. That is absolutely a mispractice.
Look, I think most policies require it, but are they enforced? That's the question. I think that's what Chief was talking about. Yeah, you're going to have a policy that says this must, that someone's going to supervise, except in some sheriffs and state police where there are no supervisors, and that becomes a real challenge for the officer. But in most cases, they're going to have that. It's just, are they really being enforced? And as he pointed out, is the supervisor being disciplined when he or she doesn't do that?
So just a step further on that one. In our policy, it is incumbent upon the supervisor to respond on the air as soon as the chase is initiated or the pursuit is initiated. But if he fails to do so, the dispatcher can then cancel that chase because the supervisor hadn't acknowledged. It is incumbent before the supervisor to acknowledge that pursuit is taking place. And then now we have to determine, well, why didn't you hear this pursuit and investigate that part of it.
Thanks, Chief Bryant. Jeff, I want to, you're already, of course, speaking about content that's in the perf report, but I want to talk about kind of what motivated the report. So you chaired the working group that penned DOJ's and PERF's, Police Executive Research Firm's report on vehicle pursuits. What motivated the report, and who else served in the working group that you chaired?
Well, I think what spawned it, so to speak, is what we're talking about. There were problems, and again, I can go back to my days in Miami, where one of the police chiefs came up to me and said, we need to study pursuits because they're killing people. And this hasn't really subsided. So a few years ago, I think we started during the pandemic in 20 is when we had our first few meetings. It's the same thing. People are dying needlessly. People are being injured. And for what? But that's the question we really need to focus on. What are these pursuits worth it? Are they worth the risk? And we have to see, we saw the number of deaths Jennifer was pointing to, which is 2 or 2.5 times the number that NHTSA reports. So we have a lot of questions. We don't have as many answers, but the PERF report did bring together 14 chiefs and high-level police officials from all sorts of agencies, and agreed unanimously that pursuits should be limited to violent crimes because of the carnage these things created. And again, it's important to understand we had a highway patrol director, we had city chiefs, we had sheriffs, we had everyone represented, including the tribal police who came and testified to us and provided information. So the unanimous agreement of limiting pursuits to a violent crime, I think, is really important.
That makes sense. And were there other, or were there, for example, unanimous agreements with respect to any pursuit intervention tactics?
Well, I think I can tell you the only disagreement among the members of the group was the pit maneuver, and we were talking about what speed is it safe.
Could you explain very briefly what a pit maneuver is for audience members?
Yeah, it's what's called a precision intervention technique. Sometimes not very precise, and sometimes not really intervening well. But it's a race car tactic. It was used originally in race cars, where the point of hitting another vehicle in the rear quarter panel was to lift the tires up, reduce the friction between the tires and the road, and spin the car around so you could go by and win the race. I believe it was Fairfax County, Virginia, that started it in the policing world. And the question we were discussing, well, it's safe at slower speeds, and I can't remember who it was, said, well, how do we know? Where are the data? And we've never seen data on the safety of a pit maneuver. Most policies limit them to 35 or 40 miles an hour, which we think is safe, but we've seen horrible results from pits at that speed. And other departments we've seen at over 100 miles an hour, and you can imagine how that ends. So that was the main area of disagreement. Everything else was unanimous, where we had our discussions and everyone agreed in the whole report, listing all of these conditions and how a policy and a practice should be developed. It was kind of amazing that the 14 different police officers and representatives from departments all agreed, except on that one point of the pit maneuver.
To to add to Jeff's point on that, some of our research covered pit maneuvers, and we did some original data collection there as well, and found that many agencies write their own rules for these pit maneuvers, and that at least 87 people have died in these crashes related to pit maneuvers.
Thank you. Thank you for that reporting. And we see in Hawaii's legislation in our model statute, pit maneuvers, we consider this a vehicle contact action. Sometimes there's things called ramming too. That is immensely dangerous and should only be done in extraordinary circumstances. And that is reflected in Hawaii's statute, New Jersey's policy, our model statute. Before we shift to Q&A, I'm going to review some of the lay of the land at the state level and best practices for enacting pursuit reform legislation. So Hawaii and DC both have comprehensive restrictive pursuit laws, and New Jersey has a comprehensive restrictive pursuit policy that's promulgated through their attorney general that applies to all New Jersey law enforcement agencies. Now, Jeff said before, what does restrictive mean? So in these states, Hawaii only permits pursuits for specified serious crimes, while DC and New Jersey only permit pursuits when the fleeing suspect is suspected of, in DC, a crime of violence, or in New Jersey, a particular serious crime, or in either state if the suspect poses an imminent threat of death or serious injury to another person. In addition, in all three of these jurisdictions, a pursuit is not automatically permitted just because the fleeing suspect committed one of the listed offenses. In general, the pursuit should also be necessary to identify or apprehend the suspect, and the safety risks caused by the suspect's flight should outweigh the safety risks of the pursuit, given how dangerous the pursuit itself is. As mentioned earlier, we have a model pursuit statute, and I just wanted to take a moment to talk about a core component of that statute that we've already discussed, which is an offense list, a list of particular serious offenses or categories of offenses that a suspect must reasonably be suspected of before an officer is permitted to pursue. Jurisdictions with loose pursuit policies, non-restrictive pursuit policies, often actually acknowledge the danger of pursuits in their policies, but they ask officers to apply a complex, indeterminate balancing test weighing many different factors, the traffic, the weather, how serious the offense is, before determining whether to pursue. And when applying these balancing tests, the data shows that officers tend to pursue far more often than under restrictive policies, like in New Jersey, like in Hawaii now, commonly chasing even for minor infractions, like having a broken taillight. An offense list, by contrast, provides officers with clarity, helping them quickly rule out many pursuits that might have needlessly resulted in injury or death, and of course, subsequent litigation. Indeed, the clarity provided by a restrictive pursuit policy is a core reason why the largest police union in the country, the New York City Police Benevolent Association, supported NYPD's recent adoption of a restrictive pursuit policy with an offense list. Now, Jennifer, I want to ask you another question. We have in our model statute, and Hawaii has in its statute, provisions requiring the collection of comprehensive data on pursuits so community members and policymakers can assess how well the reform is working. And so reporters like you don't need to do all the legwork in gathering the data. From your investigation and review of the data, what sort of data points are important to collect and publish to assess the efficacy and impact of pursuit laws and policies?
One of the major data points, aside from just the sheer number of people who are dying, is to get at the circumstances. So the initiating reason for the pursuit was one of the big data points we looked for, and that told us a lot about the types of chases that were occurring and the circumstances, and whether they were justified. We looked for race. We looked for whether that person was a passenger, bystander, or the driver, because obviously bystanders were so heavily impacted with these fatalities. So those were some of the major data points. And we also looked for the areas where these were occurring, which neighborhoods. And we wanted to know when we turned our attention to geospatial analysis, okay, so which neighborhoods and who was being affected and impacted the most? So those were some of the factors I can think of, and then just looking at the actual departments, the agencies with some of the highest number of pursuits and the circumstances around those pursuits.
That makes a lot of sense. And having a comprehensive data collection around outcomes is super important. Of course, all injuries and deaths, but also, was there any arrests made or citations made? Because part of assessing the efficacy of pursuits is, okay, when you actually do apprehend someone, did you apprehend the right person? Was there actually probable cause to arrest that person? So that's data that Hawaii collects and other jurisdictions collect as well. Speaking of Hawaii, I just wanted to briefly review some approaches that were helpful for us when advocating for pursuit reform in Hawaii. One was highlighting law enforcement support. So the fact that NYPD adopted a comprehensive restrictive pursuit policy recently, the fact that the Perth report was published in 2023, and as Jeff talked about, there was a unanimous belief that a restrictive pursuit policy with an offense list was appropriate, even though the working group was composed of 13 different chiefs and lieutenants. And you see many of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country adopting restrictive pursuit policies. Second, talking about bystander injury and kind of passenger injury. These are folks who weren't even the ones who committed the traffic infraction. Of course, committing a traffic infraction you don't deserve a death sentence for that, but certainly someone in another vehicle or someone standing on the sidewalk doesn't deserve to be seriously injured or died either. And that's also a way through reporting like Jennifer's, you can see the devastating community impact, and that often really reasonably strikes some policymakers as something that's deeply, deeply problematic. Especially when we explain to policymakers what the data shows folks are pursued for. Very, very rarely is it for violent crimes, more often for traffic infractions and nonviolent misdemeanors. And lastly, we already talked about the analogy to use of force, but a number of jurisdictions across the country, states have passed use of force reform, whether it's comprehensive reform in states like California or Maryland, or even piecemeal reform, kind of regulating chokeholds, or regulating carrying someone in or pressing your knee on someone in the prone position. These are dangerous tactics, just like a pursuit is a tactic to apprehend someone and deserves to be regulated, and there should be accountability measures just like that. Before we move to questions, I'm going to have one more question for Chief Bryant. If you were talking to another chief or even officers or the head of a police union, and they were skeptical of pursuit reform, saying, oh, we don't need, legislation or regulation of this. We can trust officers if we tell them to only pursue, when it's really called for, we can trust officers to execute that wisely. How would you kind of respond and try to get fellow law enforcement on board with pursuit reform?
Well, first of all, I think I'd tell them to take a look at Jennifer's data points and see how the data contradicts what a chief may be thinking otherwise. Additionally, one must also take into consideration how dangerous these pursuits are and what the outcome typically end up being. And then understand the liability that falls on that jurisdiction, as well as the individuals that are involved in those pursuits. And then lastly, I'll give them the evidence of what we've seen introducing a very restrictive pursuit policy. that we did not see an abandonment of our officers. It didn't frustrate our officers. And then to bring stakeholders in. I think that when you bring the stakeholders to be a part of it, you get more buy-in, and that's one of the things that we did. And I think that it has been quite effective to this day.
Thanks, Chief Bryant. Okay, we're going to shift to questions. A number of you have submitted questions already, and if you have more questions, feel free to type them in. There's a question for Jennifer. Great project. Are you continuing to collect and update the pursuit data?
Well, I have to say I've shifted to another project, but I'm interested in additional story ideas on this topic or any other topic. I'm a generalist, so I cover anything that has to do with accountability, and we have a wide mandate. So that's a long-winded way of saying we're not updating the database and, continuing that particular work, but I am interested in individual stories and the like.
And Jeff, there's a question for you. You mentioned officers, supervisors shopping, etc., to circumvent restrictive policies. And the questioner asked, are officers eager to pursue? Why? What is it about officer priorities and perspectives that makes it so hard for department leaders to call off or curtail pursuits?
That's a really good point. Pursuits are exciting. Pursuits of, driving, hurtling down the street at 80, 90 miles an hour. It's a challenge. It's what we call an adrenaline dump. And we saw, as I mentioned, the supervisor shopping so officers can do it. You grow out of it after a while. It's just like anything else. You get to the point in your age and your career where you realize these things aren't worth it. But dealing with young, particularly male cops, it becomes something they do like to do. I looked at it for a long time, but websites have pictures of high-speed chases, of big guns and tanks and aircraft, all the things that are more military than policing, in order to attract these young people, particularly men who like these adrenaline dump activities. So, and one of the really interesting things I saw very recently was what happens the first 6 months for a new chief, and I think almost all of them said, I get a call from the union or the FOP to loosen up my pursuit policy. So all of those things combined, yeah, it's exciting, it's adrenaline driven, and it's very dangerous. So we've got to have guardrails so these, particularly the young cops, understand the dangers and understand the risks they're taking to fulfill that goal of again, being all excited.
Thanks, Jeff. And now we're going to do more questions, but first I'm going to announce the CLE code for those of you seeking CLE credit. It is Pursuit 75. This is also in the chat. PURSUIT 75. Not case sensitive. There's a link to the form to fill it out. We'll also circulate that by email. Okay, back to the questions. A number of the questions are asking more about the technologies and specifically aerial drones and automated license plate readers. Folks both want to know, how common is it that these technologies are used? And also, if folks could just explain a little more how they work, like why are they eliminating the need? How are they eliminating the need for pursuits?
Well, I'll take a shot at it. These technologies are similar to what Chief was talking about earlier. It used to be the only way you'd keep an eye on a pursuit is a helicopter. Helicopters are extremely expensive. A lot of agencies don't have it, but they can afford drones. So it's not to apprehend so much as it is to track. When the car stops, because you're getting real-time data from the drone or from these GPS trackers, when the car stops or is at a certain location, you can surround it, you can bring in a big truck, you can go in the house where they are. So it's really what we call tagging and tracking technology. And again, drones, even though they're not as fast or can't go as far, some of the cities, and I believe as Chula Vista was one of the early ones, that had a series of drones throughout the city. So if a chase went by, yeah, one might run out of power, but the next one will pick it up. So it's just a good use of technology, which avoids the chase, doesn't necessarily apprehend, but does lead the officers to the area where they are, and also shows us that people slow down very quickly when the police quit chasing.
And Josh, just to add to that, talking about the LPRs, one of the things that you typically can do is track the vehicle, primarily in more your populous cities or your major cities that have a robust camera system or LPR system. If you have someone in your video integration center or your real-time crime center, they can track that vehicle throughout the city once it hits that LPR, and you no longer need a patrol car following that individual, which typically that's the reason the person is running, because they're trying to outrun the patrol car, not recognizing that we can track them that way as well.
That makes a lot of sense. This is a good question. I think it's a really tough question. I'll see if any of you would like to answer it. Jennifer mentioned the low number of officers held criminally accountable. What's the correct line between internal agency discipline and criminal liability here? Does anyone have thoughts on that?
Well, I think that one have to understand the once the officer is involved in the pursuit, they fall under the jurisdiction of the department at that time. And if there's no intent for that officer, because the officer isn't involved in a crime at that time, he's in the function of his duties and not trying to commit a crime. And so it is rare. I've not seen it unless the officer is just extremely negligent in his act and has violated most of his policies. Have anyone ever brought criminal charges against a police officer in that manner? And so I think that they are protected because they're operating under the color law.
Yes, intent's very, very important when it comes to whether, a criminal prosecution can be brought. And I'd also mention that there's another option. There's agency discipline, there is criminal discipline, and almost every state in the country has what I referred to earlier as decertification, where there's a state licensing agency that can strip an officer of their license or suspend their license for a period statewide if they engage in serious misconduct. Depends on the state. Georgia is a state where you probably could, their post likely has the authority to suspend someone for violating the law by engaging in a illegal pursuit, but there's other states whose decertification regimes are more restrictive. But that is another issue we work on and are happy to counsel you on if anyone listening would like help. One last question. This maybe is for Jennifer, although Jeff, if you know the answer. The answer may be that we actually don't know, but someone asked, is there data on which states and cities have more pursuits than others? Do we know some states are doing particularly bad or some cities are doing particularly bad, or we just don't have that level of data?
We've been arguing for decades to have national data on pursuits, and the government has not assisted. We've even asked if we have offered to be a repository, and we're unable to get funds to do that. We don't even have good data on use of force. So we have national data on neither uses of force or pursuits, and it's an embarrassment.
Do you concur with that, Jennifer?
No,
I do, and I'm happy to share a link to our homegrown database if it's at all helpful with Gabby. Share it.
Yeah, we'll circulate that by email. So that's all the time we have for questions. Please reach out to us at legislation@policingproject.org with any further questions, or if we can ever assist with guidance on vehicle pursuits or any other policing reform issue, whether it's municipal ordinances, state legislation, or law enforcement agency policies. Thank you all for attending. Thank you so much to Chief Bryant, Jennifer, Jeff for taking the time to participate in this panel and share their really, really important and interesting insights. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their week.